Change has hit Syria. Former leader Bashar al-Assad is gone, but civil war remains. While the new ruling party works to establish a government, other nations in the area are keeping a close watch, including Iran. Knowing how much Iran would love to have a hand in the future of the country, the US armed forces are trying to suppress Iranian proxies in the region, and in some cases they're doing so by force. In fact, one of the most recent and notable operations that the US military undertook was the airstrike on various militia compounds by the US Air Force. Notable about the airstrike were the type of airplanes used. These are planes that have been in use for almost half a century, but are still technologically and strategically ahead of what Middle Eastern nations are using. They are a clear message to the world, and specifically Iran, that the US military still reigns supreme, even with tech that's considered obsolete by its own standards. We're talking about the venerable A-10 Warthog. Let's start with the basics of the attack. In late November, the US deployed a number of its A-10 Warthog attack aircraft to perform precise targeted strikes on key locations in the east and south of Syria. The attacks were caught on video and posted on social media, showing the distinctive outline of the Warthog flying over urban areas. In one report, the aircraft was spotted over Deir ez-Zor, an area under the control of the Syrian Iranian-backed regime. It should also be noted that the city itself is far from the regions that were recently affected by Syrian rebels, which were in the northwest of the country. Contrary to the US's use of the A-10 Warthog to advance and pacify portions of the territory during the War on Terror in the 2000s, the strategy used in this instance is more passive and supportive in nature. The rebels, who were the biggest danger to al-Assad's regime in recent years, had already managed to take over Aleppo. This meant that the US strikes were essentially on the other end of the country and were away from the established US military presence in the south of Syria. According to a report by the Pentagon, the Warthogs were used primarily for defensive purposes. Nonetheless, they killed at least 50 militia members and destroyed vital military equipment that would reinforce the villages surrounding Deir ez-Zor. This part of the country is split between the US-backed and Kurdish-led Syrian Diplomatic Forces or SDF territory to the north and the then reigning regime to the south. By performing these strikes, the US essentially ensured that Iran and its proxies would have to reinforce that area rather than go to the northwest and create a direct counteroffensive. In the modern world, control and adaptability are everything, whether on the battlefield or in business. That's why today's sponsor Odoo is revolutionizing how people build and manage websites, making it faster, easier, and more efficient than ever. With Odoo's website builder, you can deploy a sleek, professional website in just a few clicks. There's no coding required. Whether you're launching a defense analysis blog, an e-commerce store, or a tactical training platform, a strong online presence is key to credibility and impact. Odoo's intuitive drag-and-drop system lets you customize your site with ease, while its AI-powered tools refine your messaging, generate compelling content, and optimize your calls to action, because in any mission, communication is critical. And here's the best part. Your first app with Odoo is completely free, forever. That includes unlimited hosting, customer support, and even a custom domain for the first year. No hidden fees, no surprises. Having the right strategy and the right tools makes all the difference. So click the link in the description to try Odoo's free website builder today and bring your ideas to life. Building the website you've always imagined has never been easier. Before we go any further, there are a few things we need to untangle here, as the entire situation is somewhat convoluted. First, Syria is one of the few countries in the Middle East where the US has maintained a presence even after the War on Terror. This is due to the country's fragmentation into several areas controlled by different factions and supported by various countries. For the most part, the majority of the country used to belong to the regime governed by al-Assad. The regime controlled the largest and central area, including the three largest cities, Damascus, Homs, and Aleppo. To the east, bordering the governmental territory through the Euphrates River, which is where the recent attacks took place, is the SDF, which has been one of the major oppositions to the Assad government for the past several years. This is mainly due to their holding a significant amount of territory that is naturally separated from the rest of Syria and being defended with US forces and military equipment. A relatively newer faction is the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, also known as HTS, which is comprised of various rebel groups. Up until recently, the HTS only controlled a small area in Syria's northwest, centered on Idlib and bordering Turkey, which has been a major supporter and opponent of the group throughout the 7 years of its existence. However, in November, the HTS mounted a major insurgency, starting with the area it controlled. With an estimate of around 30,000 fighters at the time of the strike, HTS is one of the less populous groups vying for control over Syria. Additionally, it's mainly self-funded, with minimal Turkish support. In fact, the Turkish government paradoxically declared the HTS a terrorist organization, but has also allowed it to work alongside the official Turkish-backed Syrian army, which is stationed along the Turkey-Syria border. The US itself maintained a zone of control with military bases at the intersection of the Iraq-Syria-Israel border. Additionally, Israel has maintained a claim over a small portion of the area bordering it, mainly to deter Iranian-backed factions from attacking Israel from Syrian soil, which they've done with mixed results. With so many factions inside Syria, all with wildly varying goals, levels of international support, and military preparedness, it's no surprise that the Syrian civil war has been a logistical, humanitarian, and historical nightmare to follow for decades. But for our purposes, we'll focus on the US and the SDF that it's supporting, as the A-10 Warthog strikes in late November were primarily conducted to help the SDF and its auxiliary goals. Some analysts aren't quite certain why the US maintains a considerable military presence in Syria to conduct attacks. For one, the American war on terror ended a few years ago, so most of the US forces have left the region. It has also cost the US enormous amounts of money, with the combined conflicts estimated to cost around $8 trillion as of 2023, as well as causing close to 1 million casualties in the process, with the true death toll count estimated to be even higher. So with Syria in practically endless turmoil between various factions, why didn't the US repeat the same process it did with Iraq when the war on terror was declared to be over? Even if there were still groups that needed to be dealt with, at least according to US military intelligence, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were considered to be over despite significant losses for the US. One of the possible reasons is that the US is still protecting Israel from continuous attacks from Iran's proxies, Syria included. Considering that the conflict between Israel and Hamas-led Gaza is still ongoing, Iranian proxies are using long-range missile and drone strikes to continuously test the latter's defense. The US providing aid to Syrian rebels is predicated on the belief that they won't then put all of their efforts into threatening Israel, thus ensuring a modicum of control in the Middle East. Both Iraq and Afghanistan don't really pose a significant threat to Israel, which is what could explain the different approaches in how the US military is stationed. But another more subtle reason might be that the US wants to use Syria's resources, particularly oil. During the civil war, there have been multiple reports of US occupational forces stealing tankers of oil from Syria and smuggling them across the border in Iraq, where they are believed to have been delivered to US military bases. What happened to the oil after it left Syria is up for debate, but it's likely that it's either being used inside military bases or forwarded elsewhere. Syria's foreign ministry estimated that if the reports are true, the overall damage dealt to the Syrian economy is around $111 billion, which is a significant portion of the country's total economy. Thus, from an economic standpoint, the US military maintaining a presence in Syria based on oil for its Middle East efforts does make sense, since the process removes the high costs of shipping and transporting the oil from the US mainland or other countries. However, Syria itself is already in an energy crisis because of the decades-long civil war that has torn up the domestic industries and manufacturing capacities, which makes allegations of the US stealing oil even more pronounced. Of course, Syria has also heavily benefited from US interventions, both financially and militarily. The US donated $1.2 billion in 2024 alone, with somewhat smaller donations present practically every year. But there's also the question of whether US troops or the US military in general should be used abroad, especially after the shortcomings of the war on terror. To this day, opinions remain divided on the topic. On the one hand, the US military being deployed in the Middle East has cost American taxpayers billions of dollars, and the soldiers themselves have been exposed to conditions and long-term warfare that would leave anyone scarred. The US military has lost 99 soldiers ever since the anti-ISIS missions began in the country 7 years ago. While this death toll is practically insignificant compared to the losses accrued by Syrians, it's still something that many people will consider when discussing whether US troops should be deployed halfway across the world. On the other hand, it's likely that the mere presence of US troops has helped dissuade Iranian proxies from trying to push to gain control over larger swathes of Syrian territory. While this has effectively prolonged the civil war by at least a few years, it's also prevented the country from becoming completely influenced and dictated by the Iranian agenda. But how has that shaped the attacks, led by the A-10 Warthogs, that have happened in recent months? Well, the Warthogs have been used to effectively cut off Syrian supply lines to Iraq and Iran. These supply lines would have likely allowed the Assad regime to retake Aleppo from the rebels. Thus, even though the US troops ostensibly acted in self-defense, it can be argued that there was a greater strategy in place. So what type of aircraft is the Warthog that it can have such an important role? The A-10 Warthog, technically called the Thunderbolt II, is a close-range combat aircraft that was developed back in the late 1960s and started production in 1972. This makes it one of the oldest types of aircraft that the US Air Force currently uses. and yet it was purpose-built to be as rugged and durable as possible, which is why some of the aircraft are decades old and have logged tens of thousands of flight hours. The US established the Warthog as a durable, survivable, and most of all cost-effective combat aircraft that will be easy to repair and maintain for future missions. It features a rugged airframe with titanium armor, often referred to as a bathtub, which surrounds the pilot, providing unparalleled survivability against ground-based threats like anti-aircraft guns and missiles. The aircraft can withstand significant damage, including losing one engine, portions of the tail or a wing section, and remain operational. The aircraft's main armament is the GAU-8A Avenger rotary cannon, a 30mm Gatling gun capable of firing 3,900 rounds per minute and is devastating against armored vehicles, tanks, and fortified ground targets, not to mention infantry. Other armaments include AGM-65 Maverick missiles, laser-guided bombs, rockets, and cluster munitions, making the Warthog extremely versatile. When it's all put together, the aircraft displays incredible versatility, at least considering it's an aerial platform that's been in use for decades. The A-10 can operate from short, rugged airstrips close to the front lines, ensuring quick response times. Meanwhile, its low-speed maneuverability allows it to loiter in combat zones, providing sustained air support to ground troops. This has been vital in the battlefields in the Middle East, as the military bases could house aircraft without building a dedicated runway to perform long-range strikes. It should be noted that the US military is tight-lipped on what aircraft or other military equipment is stationed in each of its bases. The planes that were spotted above Deir ez-Zor, if that was even the correct location, could have come from any of the US bases. However, they are most likely to have been deployed from somewhere nearby, as it would minimize the media exposure and provide minimal foretelling of the operations to the enemy. Of course, while the aircraft was designed and first built in the 1970s, that doesn't mean the entire design has remained in that decade. Modernized A-10s are equipped with advanced targeting pods, such as the Sniper or Lightning pods, which enhance precision targeting with infrared and laser-guided technology. As such, the A-10 remains highly effective in roles pertaining to asymmetrical warfare despite its age. Its ability to deliver precise firepower in support of ground forces is unmatched, excelling in asymmetric warfare, where ground targets often include lightly armored vehicles, enemy positions, and insurgent forces. In conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan, the A-10 has been instrumental in providing CAS, close air support, to troops in challenging terrain and dense urban areas. Its original role as a tank buster remains relevant in scenarios where adversaries deploy mechanized forces. Both of these effects have neatly translated to its more recent successes in Syria, as the planes don't need to do much more than deliver a few precise strikes to be effective. This is best showcased by the aforementioned asymmetrical nature of the conflict. While Iran consistently supports its proxy militia and troops across the Middle East, it's unclear how much of that support goes to common anti-air defenses and armored vehicles. The main attacks on Israel from abroad have been via long-range missiles, and the US, the UK, and Israel have launched multiple shellings via helicopter or fighter aircraft, none of which have met significant resistance so far. This would imply that Iran simply doesn't have enough anti-air platforms to spare to send to its proxies. Even if they could, it's highly unlikely that they will be of much use, as the US Air Force has airplanes that are much more capable than the simple A-10. For example, where the A-10 suffers is in technological warfare and sheer lack of speed compared to modern engines and detection systems. The main multi-role fighter aircraft that the US Air Force currently fields, the F-22s and F-35s, can blow the A-10 out of the water. However, both of these aircraft are significantly more expensive to field, deploy, repair, and maintain. In an area bereft of resources such as the military bases in Syria, the A-10 can remain operational locally. The F-22s and F-35s have to be flown in from elsewhere, further increasing the overall costs and complexity of each mission. This also reduces some of the freedom that the US command has when declaring vital military targets to take down. Consider the scale of the attacks launched via the A-10s. The planes were deployed to kill people, demolish bridges, and destroy vehicles. While more modern aircraft can accomplish all of that and much more, they could be considered overkill in terms of resources used in an attack. As mentioned, the A-10 has a much lower operational cost than a modern aircraft, which is precisely why they've been deployed in Syria for years. What the recent attack has showcased is their effectiveness and deadliness. Reports from May 2023 suggested that the US Air Force had already started using the Warthogs en masse by then. The aircraft were ordered to patrol the airspace around Syria as part of a greater effort to increase the US military presence throughout the Strait of Hormuz, Iraq, and even in the Red Sea. Using the A-10s in this manner is perhaps their only way to remain relevant in modern times. While the aircraft was arguably designed to shoot down targets during the Cold War, specifically to counter the Soviet Union, modern Russian and Chinese anti-air defenses are more than capable of annihilating them. Thus, while patrolling the Middle East, the Warthogs see much less anti-air presence overall, especially outside of Israel and Iran, arguably the two most militaristic nations in the region. This allows the Warthogs to still eke out a semblance of usability. As proof of that sentiment, there have been multiple calls to remove the Warthogs from service entirely, with the Air Force citing the same reasons for the aircraft's obsolescence as we have in this video. However, Congress has blocked these requests. Where does that leave us today? Well, the US Air Force is estimated to have around 280 A-10s in active service, but it's uncertain whether all of those planes are fully operational or in storage. It's not clear how many of these were deployed in Syria as part of the ongoing patrol attempts or directed attacks. However, regardless of the number of aircraft deployed, one thing's for certain: they've certainly proven that they still have some use in modern military doctrines. But that might not be for long. The A-10s may be having their last hurrah, fighting against enemies that have very few ways to mount a counter-threat. However, at the moment, the US is still willing to deploy its air forces to Syria, and even more importantly, conduct targeted offensive strikes on personnel and equipment, moves that will likely help the ongoing dissolution of the Assad regime. With the rebels allowed to move relatively unhampered by Iranian reinforcements, this was likely one of the major reasons why Assad, as well as Iranian and Russian forces, were forced to flee from the country only a few weeks later. Of course, the complexity of the Syrian war means that the A-10s played only a small part in the bigger picture. The fall of Assad's regime has repercussions for both Iran and Russia. Those two countries practically banked on the Syrian civil war going on for years and creating a diversion for their own purposes, namely influencing the anti-US rhetoric in the Middle East. Without al-Assad at the helm of Syria, there's an opportunity for the country to eschew its connections to the east and lean more to the west, likely with HTS forming a new government. According to the new leadership, the hope is that Syria will become a normal country by engaging in productive diplomacy with other nations, specifically Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Israel, Russia, and the US, as those have had the most influence over the civil war's outcome. But there's another possible message that the US is sending to Iran with its Warthogs. Even with the A-10s on their way out, it's likely that the patrols and attacks not only continue in the surrounding areas, but are ramped up. If the US Air Force doesn't really have any more viable targets to direct its planes at in the foreseeable future, chances are high that it will keep its focus on Iran and its proxies, creating more casualties from relentless aerial attacks. Add to that the fact that Israel has become even more aggressive towards Iran than before, launching long-range strikes designed to take out vital anti-air defenses, and Iran looks to be in one of the worst positions that it's ever been so far. But what do you think? Will we see more A-10 Warthogs being used against Iranian forces? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching.